Back in August 1942, when the call to quit India echoed across the nation, it sparked this massive countrywide movement for freedom. It was a huge moment. But if you look really closely at the old photos and the historical records, you start to notice something. A major group seems to be missing from the action. So the question is, why? At this absolutely critical moment in history, why did they decide to stay away? Let's dig in and find out.
So let's get right to the heart of it. Why did the Hindu Mahasabha officially boycott the Quit India movement? Well, to really get a handle on their decision, we need to understand two powerful forces that were pushing and pulling at the same time. First, a deep ideological disagreement that had been brewing for decades. And second, a really sharp political calculation made right in the middle of all the chaos. We'll start with the ideology.
You see, the Mahasabha's decision in 1942 didn't just come out of nowhere. Not at all. It was really the final result of a split with Congress that had been getting wider and wider for years. To really see how deep these roots go, we've got to rewind the clock a bit.
Yeah, this growing divide, it was a slow burn. It started with things like the formation of the Muslim League back in 1906, but a really major turning point, a real game changer, came in 1909 with the Morley-Minto reforms. This introduced a concept that would basically drive a wedge right into national politics: separate electorates. From that point on, you can see the Mahasabha keeping a very deliberate distance from the big Congress-led movements like non-cooperation and civil disobedience.
So what exactly were these separate electorates? Well, think of it like this. It created two parallel voting systems. In some areas, only Muslim voters could vote, and they could only vote for Muslim candidates. This wasn't just a small tweak. It fundamentally changed the political DNA of British India. And right here, this is the absolute core of the disagreement. From the Hindu Mahasabha's point of view, the fact that Congress couldn't or wouldn't block this system was a complete betrayal of national unity. They argued it was carving up the country along religious lines. And this fundamental ideological clash, well, it was only going to get stronger.
Okay, now let's pivot to the second major reason. This one is less about long-term philosophy and much more about immediate, on-the-ground political strategy. The period between 1937 and 1939 completely flipped the script and created this incredible, unexpected opening for parties like the Hindu Mahasabha.
So picture this, it's 1937, right after the provincial elections, and the political map is just dominated by Congress. They absolutely swept the polls, forming governments in 8 out of the 11 provinces. For groups like the Hindu Mahasabha and the Muslim League, this was a massive defeat. It pretty much pushed them to the sidelines of politics. But then, just 2 years later, something huge happens. World War II breaks out. And the British Viceroy, without talking to a single Indian leader, declares that India is now part of the war. As you can imagine, this didn't go over well. In protest of this unilateral move, every single Congress ministry resigned in October 1939.
Think about that for a second. In one single move, the most dominant political party in the country just walked away from power. This act of protest had an immediate and massive consequence. It created a gigantic power vacuum all across India. All those seats of government were suddenly empty, just waiting to be filled.
Now, for the parties that got crushed in the 37 elections, this was an almost unbelievable opportunity, a golden ticket. With Congress out of the picture, the British still needed people to run the provincial governments. The Hindu Mahasabha jumped at this chance, forming coalitions to create governments in key provinces like Bengal, Sindh, and the Northwest Frontier Province.
So you see the chain reaction here, right? The Congress resignations created a void, and the Hindu Mahasabha stepped right in, gaining the kind of political power they just couldn't win at the ballot box. And you have to keep this context in mind for what happens next.
And all of this brings us right to August 1942 and the start of the Quit India movement. The Mahasabha's decision-making process now wasn't just about ideology anymore. It was about protecting their brand new position of power.
This is the key. You have to remember this. When Gandhi made his famous do or die speech, the Hindu Mahasabha wasn't an opposition party protesting from the outside. No, they were in government. They were working within the British system. And that completely changed their political math.
And this quote, wow, it lays out their official stance as clearly as possible. The leader of the Hindu Mahasabha, V.D. Savarkar, sent out a direct order to all members, especially those holding government positions. The instruction was crystal clear. Hold on to your posts, whether in assemblies, local bodies, or government jobs, and do not, under any circumstances, join the movement.
Okay, so let's tie this all together.
The decision to boycott the Quit India movement really came down to two powerful intersecting forces. One was all about ideology, and the other was about pure, hard-nosed strategy.
It really all came down to a balancing act. On one side of the scale, you had decades of deep-seated ideological opposition to how Congress was doing things. But on the other side, you had the very real, very tangible prize of political power, something they had only just gotten their hands on. In the end, for them, strategy won out over the call for struggle.
So, what are the big takeaways here, especially for those of you studying for exams? First, remember that history is rarely about snap decisions. The Mahasabha's choice had very deep roots. Second, that 1939 resignation by Congress, that was a massive turning point that totally reshaped Indian politics. And finally, in 1942, the Hindu Mahasabha made a clear strategic choice. They prioritized holding on to power over joining a mass protest.
And this leaves us with a bigger question to chew on, doesn't it? Every single group involved in the freedom struggle was making these kinds of strategic choices, all based on their own ideologies and circumstances. Understanding these different paths and really getting why they were taken is so important for understanding not just our past, but the incredibly complex political world that independent India would eventually inherit.